Stay curious, stay calm. You feel the ship settle into the night before you ever see the stars. A long inhale of salt, tar, and wood that seems to pull the ribs of the hull inward. Below you, the hold breathes in its own way, warm, close, and thick with other people's breath. A lamp swings somewhere up in the waist. A loose rope creaks, water whispers against planking. For a moment, the world is only the skin of the ship, and the chorus of small sounds that belong to a body at sea. In the hold, there is no night and no day as an island knows them. Light becomes a rumor. Hands learn to find seams and other hands by memory. You press your face against the timber, and the grain is a map. Old scratches, salt, dried blood that historians note in logs, and whose objectivity they argue over. Your lungs fill with the mixed smoke of lanterns and stale food. Clothes, if you have any, are damp with sea spray and sweat. 100 faces, or more, are turned away from the weak light. Some sleep, some murmur, some cough into cupped hands. Somewhere near the center, a child wails and is quieted. The sound travels like a small animal along the ribs. This is not a story of a single man or woman on a single voyage. It is a chorus of thousands of documented crossings that historians have traced across maps and surgeons' journals, a pattern of practice and policy, of choices made to balance profit against lives. The hold on a Middle Passage ship is where economic logic and human bodies meet. For months in the early modern and modern period, men, women, and children were taken from their homes along the West African coast and packed into the lower decks of European and American vessels bound for the Americas. What happens now, beneath the faint clink of chains and the soft scraping of canvas on wood, is what made the Middle Passage a central, unsparing chapter in modern history. You can feel the packing. Bodies are measured and laid out to save space, historically recorded as tight packing on some voyages, loose on others, though both are brutal to those who endure them. Wood smells like the story of measurement, the shipwright's rule, and the trader's ledger. Men lie on their sides or backs with little room to turn. Women are often kept apart or in a corner where privacy is a rumor. That separation is deliberate. Captains feared contagion, revolt, and the complications of childbirth aboard. Children are pressed close to mothers. The floor is not bare planking for long. It becomes littered with straw, the remains of meals, discarded cloths, and waste. Latrines, where they exist, are primitive. The rest becomes part of the hold's damp biography. You imagine hands finding hands under the board, a thumb in a palm, a braid stroked to quiet a fever. Touch here is a small and dangerous language, a map of comfort that must be kept secret from prying eyes above. The crew walk on the deck above with lanterns and instruments of discipline. Whistles, cables, and the threat of the lash are part of the soundscape. But below, people invent rhythms to survive. Some rock gently to mimic the ocean, some hum in low, lineal tunes whose notes curl like smoke through the planks. These sounds will not appear in the captain's log, but they are the true ledger of endurance. Disease is always close. The ship is a machine for contagion. Sweat, cramped respiration, scarcities of fresh water, and a diet that cannot replace what is lost at sea. Historians rely on surgeons' journals, the cold pages where men paid to keep others alive recorded fevers, dysentery, and death, to reconstruct what often went unrecorded elsewhere. Those entries are clinical and partial: mortality high, putrid fever, loss by flux. In the hold, names are rarely given in the log. Numbers and causes are written in ink that will travel back to owners and insurers. Still, the human detail slips through. Notes about several women in travail or men confined after an outbreak let us peer into the small catastrophes. You taste the rations in your mouth if you let memory take you there. Coarse biscuit that has been soaked and reheated, salted pork that leaves a metallic film on the tongue, water that sometimes tastes of iron because it has sat in the same cask too long. Food is a negotiation. Captains and owners calculate how many days of biscuit and salted meat are needed and how much risk of spoilage will be faced. Sometimes captives were forced to exercise on deck, a cruelly named dancing to keep them healthy enough to sell. Sometimes those same exercises were a reprieve, a moment to feel the sun and the wind on skin for the first time in weeks. There is also a dark ergonomics to the hold: shackles and the iron that binds wrists or ankles, rings keyed to prevent moving about, sometimes a bar across chests to keep a man from sitting up. These implements are described in abolitionist pamphlets and court testimonies, with an economy almost as clinical as the surgeons. Seeing them in a museum cabinet today, amid neat labels and glass, can feel like a betrayal of the living complexity those objects once contained. At the center of all this is a kind of waiting. The sea stretches in all directions, and the days are nearly indistinguishable, a rhythm of pitching timber and the occasional shout from above. You listen for the sound that tells you a change is coming, the creak of the capstan, the unexpected hush when sails are trimmed, boots thumping the deck in the night. Those noises above are where decisions are made, whether to make landfall for water, whether to heave to in a storm, whether to trade in a port of the Caribbean or Brazil. Below, people sense those decisions as the difference between survival and disaster. And yet even in waiting, histories of resistance appear. A muffled laugh that is really a plan. A language passed along in stitchwork. The small, private economies of favors and exchanged morsels. The human imagination in the hold refuses the ledger's logic. It makes songs, stories, prayers, bargains. Something shifts now, a voice muffled, higher than the ordinary murmuring, and then a sound that might be a slap on wood. The ship answers with a far-off shout from above. You learn the ledger before you learn names. In the chaptered arithmetic of the slave trade, human life is first an entry, a number, a footnote, a space to be economized. The hold is laid out like a ledger page. Planks become columns. Bundles of bodies become rows. Above deck, men with charts and rules pace and calculate. Below, the living become units whose spacing, stacking, and survival are all matters of predictable calculation, at least to those who profit. The best-known image of that calculus is also one of the simplest, the outline of the British slave ship Brookes, drawn in 1788 and used by abolitionists to show the cramped arrangement of captives. It is a hard, legalistic picture, profiles of men lying in the hold, arranged shoulder to shoulder, head to foot, so the drawing shows in a single glance how bodies were packed. The diagram became a political weapon because it translated moral horror into a diagram that jurists, merchants, and ordinary readers could understand. It also fixed an image in public imagination. The plan, the measurement, the idea that bodies could be folded to fit cargo holds. That folding had rules, however unscrupulous. Captains kept logs with calculations for provisions and breathing space. Slavers kept contracts that listed the permissible number of people per ton of ship. The terms tight and loose packing were not rhetorical choices alone. They were different business models. Tight packing meant more human cargo, and a calculation that even if mortality rose, the voyage could still be profitable. Loose packing meant fewer people, less risk of crowd disease, longer survival odds. Owners argued over which was more lucrative. Many captains in their letters and journals admitted the brutal trade-off. Crowd more people and more will die. But the survivors sold could offset losses. The arithmetic of profit is a cold kind of mortality table. Below, such arguments become algorithms of touch. What feels like inches matters, the tilt of a shoulder, the inability to sit up without elbowing a neighbor, the impossibility of turning over once sleep takes hold. Children sleep pressed into angles adults learn to accept. Women, when allowed, huddle together like small covens. Every movement is guarded. If a man tries to shift to ease a cramp, a crewman's boot on the grating is a reminder. Motion above is monitored and often punished. Surgeons, if the ship carries one, are part physician, part accountant. Their journals measure life in temperatures, days of fever, and the flux that carried so many to the grave. Yet surgeons also note measurements of space and condition, the dimensions of compartments, the number of persons assigned to each, and the arrangement of hammocks or planks. They write about exercising captives, a grim euphemism for dragging people up to the deck to walk or dance so that their lungs might clear and their limbs not stiffen to death. These exercises are sometimes the thin lifeline that keeps the cargo marketable, sometimes a shaming spectacle meant to break spirits. The record is ambivalent, charity to keep people alive, cruelty wrapped as medical necessity. There is also a meticulousness to violence. Shackles are cataloged, iron collars, fetters keyed and stored, the bars that hold the 2 rows of captives in place at night. Men who were branded or marked leave traces in depositions and court testimony. Those marks become, for legal people, proof of ownership. Merchants talk of indentures, insurance policies, and returns on investment in the same breath as they negotiate the cost of iron and the time it takes for a smith to fit new shackles. In the hold, the metallic smell of iron mingles with sweat and the acidic tang of vomit. The smell is a commodity's odor and the human odor of terror. The measure of time is also stamped into the hold's layout. Rations are portioned according to days at sea and expected landfall. Water casks are counted and placed so that the crew can police access. The prisoners below rarely touch a fresh cask. Salted meat and ship's biscuit become the calculus of survival. An officer calculates how long bread will last if it is soaked and distributed in smaller portions. A woman learns to scrape crumbs from the corners of a barrel to feed a child. The ledger above and the hand that scours the barrel below know arrays of scarcity, and there are other or less visible metrics. The languages in the hold are counted too, dozens of tongues, dialects, and pidgins, each a map of origin that officers sometimes attempt to record. Merchants prize certain ethnic groups because of perceived skills, physical strength, or market preference. They tried to match buyers' tastes in the Americas. These categorizations, often crude and racist, shaped who was taken where. Contemporary testimonies like those of Olaudah Equiano, who published his narrative in 1789, and others later recounted how language, lineage, and region became commodities measured on a manifest. Their voices give human shape to ledger entries, a name, an age, a place, a torn family story. But the practical work of measuring and arranging is never simply administrative. It affects daily rituals. Who eats first? Who is given a scrap for a baby? Who is allowed a moment of washing? It changes the way grief arrives. In a cramped space, there is no private place to mourn. When someone dies, the procedure is pragmatic and often cold. The body is moved, rolled, or stacked, and space is made for the living. Sometimes a brief space is cleared, and a burial on the open sea is delayed until a storm or a change of course. Sometimes bodies are thrown overboard to lighten the load or out of fear of contagion. The language used in logs, thrown overboard, buried at sea, flattens what for those who survived would have been a devastating personal rupture. Resistance, however, appears in how people refuse to be measured. A woman will hide a child's face or wrap it in cloth so buyers cannot assign a price. Men will try to arrange themselves so their posture deceives the crew measuring for space. Small rebellions take arithmetic as their foil. If the plan is to fold bodies into a compact grid, people spread, shift, and refuse the geometry. Those resistances are dangerous and small, but they crack the neatness of the ledger. The counting system depends on compliance. Where people refuse to be counted, the accounting phrase. Tonight, the ship's bosun steps over the grating with a notebook tucked into a wet jacket. He is calculating supplies. His pencil scratches the plank. Above, lantern light flares. A creak of timber, the low voice of the mate issuing an order. Then, a sharp knock on wood, 3 calls in quick succession. A new sound, different from coughs and whispers, runs through the hold. A summons that will change the balance of ledger and life. Above the noise and orders of the deck, the surgeon's cabin is small and bright with a different economy. Bottles, jars, a narrow table, and a leather-bound book whose pages the surgeon trusts as he trusts his instruments. That book is the ledger in a literal and moral sense. It is where he records names, often only ages and origins, symptoms and outcomes, reagents used, and the number of deaths. The surgeon's journal is clinical, precise, and sometimes compassionate. It is also part of the machinery that keeps the voyage legible to owners and insurers. Surgeons on slaving voyages performed a strange balancing act. They were employed by owners to keep human cargo fit for sale. In that remit, medicine is inseparable from commerce. Surgeons administered fresh air and exercise when instructed, measured food rations, and treated wounds and fevers. They were also paid a bonus for lives preserved. Insurance and profit were written into their pay. This economic incentive shaped their notes and decisions. Surgeons whose journals survive occasionally confess their unease in asides, the terse private lines tucked between clinical entries. Even as the ledger proceeds to tabulate men, women, and children like other shipboard stores. What the ledger does not fully show is the practice inside the hold. Treatments were basic by modern standards and often dangerous. Bleeding remained a default therapy for many ailments. It meant cutting and cupping designed to rebalance humors. Purgatives, including calomel, a mercury compound used as a vigorous emetic and laxative, were commonly employed to cleanse bodies. Surgeons used tinctures and the limited pharmacopoeia of the age: spirits, camphor, laudanum when available, and poultices of herbs. When sores festered or limbs were crushed, amputation was a last resort, grisly and sometimes unavoidable when shipboard accidents or gangrene advanced. Hygiene, where practiced at all, was pragmatic. Fresh water was precious. Even the crew rationed it. Surgeons urged captains to heave to or put into sheltered bays to collect water and to air the hold, a process where captives were brought up, if only for short, supervised periods. These measures sometimes improved outcomes. Sometimes the sea's demands and profit imperatives prevailed. When a surgeon wrote that he exercised the people for a week, he meant forced appearances on deck under watchful eyes, often under the threat of arms. The exercise was medicine and display at once, a pause between survival and spectacle. The ledger is also where the surgeon weighs contagion. The words used, contagious fever, putrid flux, smallpox, reflect both observation and the limits of contemporary diagnosis. Smallpox, when it appeared, was terrifying: pustules, soaring fevers, and rapid spread in cramped quarters. Surgeons sometimes recorded attempts at inoculation or, in later decades, noted vaccination among crew, but captives rarely received preventive measures, either from prejudice or logistic limits. Dysentery, the flux, was a recurrent nightmare. The hold's damp and the poor diet produced epidemics that a surgeon could only patch and chronicle. Mortality statistics and ledgers became instruments of legal and political debate. Abolitionists placed surgeons' journals alongside diagrams of packed holds to make the moral case. Owners and captains countered with accounts of storms, spoilage, and unidentifiable fevers to claim sea life as a hazard rather than a crim. In insurance claims and court records, a surgeon's entry, blank or detailed, could shift liability. The ledger, then, is a contested text, a piece of evidence used differently depending on who reads it. Yet beneath the numbers, the ledger sometimes betrays domestic detail. A surgeon might note, woman in labor attended, male child born, mother weak. Those short entries pin bureaucratic pages to singular lives. The cry of a newborn in a place where births were medically risky and socially invisible, the small private acts of attending an infant, of binding a wound. These notes humanize the cargo in ways the manifest never will. They are brief windows into the continuity of family. Even when families have been torn by capture, surgeons kept more than the medicine. They kept the secrets shipboard life generated. Their journals include remarks on insubordination, on suspicious behavior, and on attempted escape. They note where deaths cluster by row or near a particular hatch, triggering rumors in ports about contaminated provisions or the hygienic state of holding pens. Contemporary testimonies use these entries to build narratives. A row where flux took, many becomes evidence of negligence or malfeasance. A record of careful airing becomes proof the captain took precautions. Modern historians read ledgers against other sources, manifests, crew journals, port records, to triangulate the lived realities beneath the ink. Importantly, the surgeon's ledger is not neutral. It is written within power relations and economic incentives. Payments for preservation of life could motivate certain practices. Underreporting of deaths could happen when owners feared financial consequences. Conversely, some crew inflated mortality claims and insurance fraud. For those who survived the voyage, the ledger would become an archival ghost, a dry, official record that later fed abolitionist pamphlets, court inquiries, and historians' reconstructions. It bears witness, but also bears the marks of the system it served. At night, the surgeon's lamp throws a circle of light over his pages. He writes by a practiced hand, ink blotting where water has spattered. Below, a cough punctures the humid hush and the surgeon's pen pauses. He makes a new entry: 3 taken with putrid fever, ordered isolation, improved with airing. The phrasing is clinical, but the action is a human response to human suffering. He descends into the humid hold where measurement and medicine meet, answering a call from the lower tier. Food aboard a slaving vessel is geography and policy at once. Where barrels sit, who may access them, and how they are counted decide life and death. The smell of provisions is the first map you learn: the sharp tang of rum, the tight floury dust of ship's biscuit, the briny cured stink of salted meat. These are not mere calories. They are instruments by which captains measure risk, owners calculate profit, and people below the deck keep a fragile ledger of things still possible. Ship's biscuit, hardtack, sea bread, is the basic starch. It keeps when dry but becomes a new thing when soaked, softened in water or tea into a bland pap-like mash that fills the belly but not the imagination. Weevils often live in the cracks. Their bodies and the powder they leave are a texture people learn to ignore or to pick out with ritual patience. Salted beef and pork are preserved by salting and smoke, but barrels fail, brine seeps, and meat rots into a smell that sets teeth on edge. Once spoiled, meat can sprout maggots. Once the taste changes, fear follows. Water is the most precarious currency. Fresh water is stored in casks. It sloshes and takes taste from oak and iron. Rainwater can be caught in canvas or on deck, but storms blur the pleasure of a fresh cask with the danger of contamination. When supply dwindles, captains ration strictly. A measured cup becomes the unit of hope. Crew and captives rarely receive equal water. Crew often have easier access and can petition for more. Captives drink from allocated buckets or shared drains. Nutritional failure turns to disease. Scurvy, the lack of fresh citrus, is the steady threat. By the mid-18th century, experiments showed citrus prevented scurvy, and navies began to adopt citrus rations, but private slaving ventures were inconsistent. Owners who feared spoilage or cost sometimes skipped fresh fruit, betting on shorter passages or fair weather. The result shows in surgeon journals: gaunt faces, loose teeth, swollen gums, and slow, debilitating deaths that medicine aboard can only palliate. The galley divides ship life. Sailors receive cooked meals and a daily rum ration, grog, a measure meant to steady nerves. Below, captives receive measured portions through hatches or in buckets. A small handful of softened biscuit, maybe a spoonful of rice or peas, rarely the boiled meat served to crew. Quantity and quality vary with supply, with the captain's mood, and with merchants' calculations about profit and time. Ration reduction is a business decision as much as a cruelty. Microeconomies form in the squeeze. Sailors trade tobacco, cloth, or an extra piece of bread for favors. Captives exchange scraps, cloth, or services among themselves. These small markets are policed and punished, but they are also survival strategies, ways to comfort a child with a hidden scrap, or to provide a bandage in exchange for a morsel. Some crew members smuggle food down for a moment of mercy, risking lash or confinement. Others hoard the best stores for themselves. Rot is structural. Rats gnaw at sacks and barrels, breed in hollows, and carry disease. Casks shift in storms, bungings fail, and spoiled provisions contaminate others. The bilge, the ship's lowest belly, festers, and when rain or salt water mixes with stores, the taste and smell of everything changes. Weevils perforate biscuits. Maggots feed in meat left too long. The crew scraps off ruined surfaces and tosses the worst overboard. But what is left still sustains or sickens those below. Records preserve these choices. Surgeon journals and captain's logs document spoilage, rationing decisions, and cask leaks. Abolitionist pamphlets later used such entries to show how provisioning choices increased mortality. Testimonies like those of Olaudah Equiano describe the humiliation of hunger, the scarcity of water, and the dull monotony of meals that are more about survival than nutrition. Merchants in courts counter with weather, storms, and unpredictable spoilage. The evidence rarely removes the ethical weight of the choices. Hunger reshapes behavior. Starvation sharpens tempers, draws people into fights over a handful of biscuit, and makes theft a matter of survival. Captives hide crumbs in hems or carve marks into planks to remember stashes. Sickness breeds suspicion. If a row falls ill after sharing water from a particular cask, accusations flare. In cramped space, small funerals are improvised. A scrap of cloth might wrap a body before it is moved to the deck for disposal. The social choreography is cruelly precise. A mate calls a roll and signals distribution. The bosun scoops into a pail and shouts numbers. Those below learn to present hands, to bend without looking, or to make a particular sound as claim. Children develop rituals, tapping rhythms on wood to attract attention, or using a patched scrap of cloth as a signal among kin. Provisioning choices also make markets. Buyers in the Americas preferred certain ages, genders, and apparent health. Captains calculated how many to carry and how to feed them so as to arrive with a marketable cargo. If a cask springs a leak near the stern, its contents may be sacrificed to lighten the ship or to stop contamination. And those below lose not just water, but a thread of survival. Tonight, when the mate's shout runs down the ladder, the word that follows is worse than a leak. The cask is full of blackish residue, wormy matter and taint, and must be opened and cut away. The bosun's boots thunder above as men prepare to heave. Iron has a voice. It clicks, it rubs, it eats its skin until flesh grows used to the sound. In the hold, the metal says where a body may move and where it must not. Bilboes, leg irons, and short chains loop through wooden rings. Sometimes a heavier collar fits around a wrist or neck. The iron is cold at first touch, and then it warms to the body, leaving a raw red line where leather or skin once covered muscle. The smell of rust mixes with sweat. The squeal of metal on metal becomes a punctuation mark in daily life. Shackling is not merely practical, it is symbolic. A ring closes more than an arm, it closes a story. Captains and traders expect iron to restrain and demoralize. But iron is improvable, and the human eye that watches for subversion can sometimes be fooled. Chains that rattle in a large, noisy hold can be lost in the chorus of coughs. A hand that fits a small nail or a stolen file learns how to make a hinge give. Men and women study the structural vulnerabilities of their prison. A corroded staple behind a plank, a rotted twine knot, a loose backing under a straw mattress. Those weaknesses become leverage. Resistance on the middle passage often began in silence. Conversations were stitched into clothing, murmured into cupped hands, whispered in the rhythm of scraping and sewing. People hid small things in hems and hollowed wooden planks, a tiny blade concealed inside the husk of biscuit, a sharpened bone tucked beneath a child's mat, a length of cord coiled and passed hand to hand. These were utilitarian implements, tools of survival that could, in particular moments, become instruments of revolt. Plans, when they existed, were cautious and adapted cleverly to the ship's environment. A common tactic was to wait for a time when the crew felt secure, at night when watch shifts were thin, or during the exercise on deck when captives were exposed in numbers and mates might be distracted. Sometimes conspirators feigned illness to be taken on deck, then seized an opportune moment to rush toward a storeroom or to overwhelm a single man near a hatch. The goal could be to take a small boat and flee, to secure arms and try to steer the ship, or simply to create a diversion so others might slip free. The calculus was brutal. Success might mean freedom, failure meant a savage retribution. Not all rebellions aimed to capture the vessel. Small acts of sabotage were frequent and could be effective. Ropes cut to disable a sail, a spar loosened so that rigging snarled the deck, stores hidden or spoiled to create supply crises. Some captives tried to poison provisions or taint water, others refused to eat, a form of passive resistance that turned appetite into protest. Such refusals were dangerous but could be an assertion of agency, an insistence that if one must die, it would not be at the merchant's schedule. Coordination required ingenuity. Signals had to be discreet, taps in a triple rhythm along planks, a particular cough that meant now, a line of song whose first verse hit a count. Language barriers complicated planning. People from diverse regions devised pidgin codes, teaching each other brief phrases and gestures. Contemporary narratives and later interviews show how captives used the cadence of work and the cover of song to coordinate, turning daily labor into a hiding place for conspiratorial exchange. The crew's response was swift and brutal. Once a plan was suspected or uncovered, punishments were public and exemplary: flogging across the deck, solitary confinement in irons, and, in the most extreme cases, summary execution. The spectacle of punishment served two purposes: pain and deterrence. Captains recorded these actions in logs. Mates kept lists of flogged men to show owners that discipline had been enforced. Abolitionist writers later used witness testimonies and such records to show the cruelty that discipline masked as order. Yet, repression also bred desperate courage. Some uprisings succeeded, briefly, when a small group managed to overpower a handful of crew and seize a boat, making for nearby coasts or islands. A few of those cases reached courts and print, which is why they linger in historical memory. Many more failed, their traces reduced to jagged lines and logs. A torn sail, a shattered hatch, a bloodied plank. Still, even failed attempts altered the voyage's course and the crew's vigilance. A cut rope might force an unscheduled stop. A slashed sail might expose the ship to weather and delay. The psychology of binding and revolt is intimate and communal. A mother who sees her child threatened may risk everything in a fierce, single act. An elder may plan to distract men so the young can scramble to a seam. Religion and shared memory shape decisions. A song can become a call to courage, a prayer a code to move. People drew on remembered tactics from home, ways to move silently, to signal with small gestures, to create diversions. These were not theatrical heroics but practical knowledge carried across the ocean. Surgical and captain's records sometimes note the consequences in spare language. Attempted insurrection, 4 executed, several flogged, discipline restored, but those lines flatten the human cost. Families torn, names lost, futures severed. Survivor testimonies and interviews collected by abolitionists and, later historians, recover more. The sudden terror of a lantern cast low on a deck, the thud of a body struck, the wailing of children as men were marched away. The legal record turns these broken lives into exhibits. Memory and song preserve the rest. Tonight, after the bosun's boots thundered earlier and men scrambled to cut away the spoiled cask, a different sound threads through the hold. A soft tapping in triple rhythm under the boards, faint and near the row that had been chained most tightly. A whisper passes from hand to hand like a current. Somewhere, iron scrapes against something hard. A new plan moves in the dark. Above, a lantern swings with unexpected steadiness. You learn the ship's language of sickness by ear. It begins with small, private noises. A throat cleared softly in the dark, a wet cough muffled into a folded arm, the uneven rhythm of a breath that shortens with the hours. At first, these sounds are background, a human murmur under the creak of timber. If disease takes hold, they grow into a chorus that supplies the hold with its own weather. Rasping inhalations, the explosive cough of smallpox, the watery sounds of dysentery. Illness has textures as well as sounds. A feverish person will sweat through their shirt, and skin may shine with the glazed sheen of fever. They clutch cloths, press hands to convulsing bellies, or fold knees to chest to ease cramps. The sick make small economies of touch, a damp rag pressed to a blister, spirituous liquor warmed on a palm, a child's hair smoothed back by someone who can hardly stand. These gestures are private, shared in the narrow intimacy of the hold. Surgeons wrote what they could hear and see, and their entries translate into a barber surgeon's repertoire: observation, purgative, bleeding, poultice, and the frequent recommendation to air the hold. When putrid fevers strike, the breath itself seems wounded, fetid, sour, a smell that rises like a visible vapor when a hatch is opened. The crew tries crude remedies, burning sulfur to fumigate, waving vinegar-soaked rags, scattering ash and lime in corners. Sometimes these measures help. Sometimes the illness runs faster than any remedy. The small, sharp sounds of care are constant. A mate lifts a head on a wet shoulder to offer a sip from a bucket. Someone tears a strip of linen to bind a wound. Another holds a lamp while a surgeon works in feeble light. The lamp's hollow clink, the rustle of cloth, and the surgeon's whispered commands form a separate, low register in which bodies are tended. There is also the heavy administrative scratch of pen on paper when another death is entered, and that sound has its own gravity. Death has an acoustic signature that everyone learns. Sometimes it is a sudden, convulsive gasp, and a silence that arrives like a closed door. Other times it is a prolonged, rattling farewell, labored breaths slowing and stopping in a wet, irregular cadence. In the hold, silence after that cadence is absolute. People listen for it because it means a practical response. A body is wrapped in cloth or sail, moved up the ladder, and prepared for disposal at sea. Sometimes corpses are kept for a brief interval, if weather, superstition, or a captain's order permit, but more often the practical need to move on dictates swift action. Contagion creates social cleavages. Crews sometimes isolate whole rows, fastening small barricades and posting armed men to keep others from approaching. The fear of infection produces both cruelty and care. Captives can be abandoned when a captain deems the risk unacceptable, yet at other times people organize and share what little they have. Women often become caregivers by necessity, washing soiled linens, trying to staunch bleeding, comforting the delirious. Those acts of tending are rarely recorded in official pages, but they stitch together many small resistances and mercies. The sound of panic is different from the sound of illness. Panic is the sharp, repeated cry that punctures the night, a call that the crew interprets as insubordination or a sign of contagion. Rumors travel fast. Sick by the aft, several dead by the starboard hatch, infected water. The captain must decide quickly whether to alter course, call into an unplanned port, or risk extra days that a stop will cost. Those decisions are made in quick commands above. Below, people watch and wait, aware that any choice could be the margin between life and death. There are quieter resistances embedded in care. People invent treatments from plants they remember at home, chewed leaves for poultices, bitter broths to steady a stomach. They teach each other how to bind wounds, where to press against a fevered limb, how to steady a child in delirium. A lullaby becomes a remedy. A prayer becomes a compress. These practices are hybrid, part tradition, part improvisation, and always adapted to the constraints of the hold. They do not cure all, but they preserve dignity and human connection. When an outbreak escalates, the ship's rhythm changes. Watches double, hatches are battened more frequently, and the surgeon's ledger grows heavy with crossings and marginal notes. The crew may grow more punitive, disciplining those accused of spreading infection. At other times, small mercies appear, extra rations for a row hit by fever, a sailor slipping down a crust of bread, a surgeon begging the captain to heave to and take on fresh water. These moments reveal the fragile range of choices available on a vessel driven by profit and weather. Sickness reshapes song and speech. Delirium knits nightmares out of half-remembered voices. Names blur and fragments of home survive as hummed refrains. For the living, those fragments are cultural anchors, a shared tune, a proverb, a memory that helps people find each other when language fails. Care and memory travel together in the smallest noises, a whispered name, a repeated verse, a palm on a brow. Tonight the coughs have multiplied. From aft comes a staccato chorus and a child's thin, piercing cry. The surgeon's lamp swings as he descends. Someone above snaps a command. The hold's weather has shifted toward the dangerous, damp, still, and heavy, with the sour promise of putrid fever. The surgeon's shadow falls long across the planks. Night in the hold is layered with different kinds of care. Where men sometimes meet in low councils to plan or to sleep with a clenched jaw, women build small, private economies of protection. Their work is quiet and continuous, bundling rags into padded supports, smoothing a child's hair against fevered skin, whispering an ancestor's name in a language the crew does not know. These acts make a fragile domestic inside a place designed to strip domesticity away. The air smells of tar and boiled linen. Fine threads of salt collect along hems. In that small world, attention is labor. Children are both vulnerable and central. Buyers prize infants for domestic work and calculate a child's future yield, much like a cask of salted meat. For those below deck, a child is first a person to be kept warm, fed, and hidden from prying eyes. Mothers cluster to share warmth and trade morsels. A scrap of soaked biscuit divided carefully can feed two small mouths. Tiny bodies are pressed into laps. Cheeks are rubbed with oil to soothe chafed skin. The rhythm of a lullaby, soft, repetitive, with a steady, rocking cadence, soothes fevered breathing and preserves a thread of home. Secrecy becomes technique. A mother fearing separation sews a name into a hem or slips a bead beneath a fold of cloth. These small markers, knotted threads, a strip of colored fiber, a particular stitch, are acts of legal imagination. If they survive, a token may later prove kinship in a foreign court or be recognized by an elder. Older women teach younger ones these tricks, passing on cunning and whispered lessons beneath hatchlight. They hide small seeds, a carved bone, a strip of indigo, objects that carry place names and kin lines without ink. Birth aboard to ship concentrates risk. Surgeon logs record with terse lines. Woman in labor, male child born, mother weak. But those entries collapse a long ordeal into ink. Midwifery in the hold is improvised. Women who carried experience at home become midwives, using boiled linen, whispered instruction, and botanical knowledge to calm fever. Leaves chewed into poultices, hot compresses of vinegar or herb, and the pressure of a hand at the sacrum become available tools in a rolling, cramped space. A delivery rearranges rhythm, lamps lowered, women forming a ring, every breath counted as if it were a metronome. Sexual violence is part of this chapter's shadow. Records and narratives document assaults and coerced sex. Testimonies and depositions record pregnancies born of violence without graphic detail, but with painful clarity about consequences. Women developed survival strategies, sleeping in groups to deter predation, sharing watch duties, refusing certain spaces near hatches, and rotating companions so no woman slept alone where a crewman might take advantage. Some claimed illness to avoid selection or sought places on deck where oversight was greater. These practices were not fail-safe, but they created collective vigilance that sometimes reduced risk. Children become nodes of negotiation. Buyers may demand young boys for field labor or girls for domestic work. Mothers negotiate with pain and cunning. A lie about age, a quick bribe of a cloth scrap, or a secret pact among women could buy hours or move a child into another lot. These tactics turned market logic back on itself. Women used merchants' preferences against them, claiming infirmity when a child might otherwise be taken away or insisting an infant was already promised to a household to delay sale. Nursing is its own economy. Lactation resists commodification. Nursing mothers sometimes withhold milk as protest or share it in communal wet nursing arrangements that bind strangers into kin. Milk becomes both nourishment and mutual obligation. Surgeons who observed these practices noted them with surprise. Abolitionist writers later highlighted such acts as proof of deep human bonds formed under duress. Wet nursing networks spread resources. A grandmothering figure might take several infants in rotation so that others could work or sleep. Education in the hold is oral and tactile. Mothers and elders teach names, short songs, and lists of kin places, tiny catalogs of identity that can survive suppression. Counting games, river names, and lullabies are mnemonic devices that preserve belonging when paper and auction would erase it. These refrains are short, snatches of market towns, a mother's blessing, the rhythm of a particular river, yet they carry lineage forward and become the first lessons a child ever learns. Secrecy extends beyond family. Women sometimes act as repositories for small goods, a length of cloth wrapped around a charm, a carved bead, or a kernel of grain hidden in a stitch. These objects comfort, signal identity, and occasionally become legal artifacts. Courts sometimes encountered such items. An amulet turned into evidence, a seam that contained a note, and fragments have, in a few cases, helped reconnect families decades later. A particular knot or the pattern of a stitch could mean be ready, hide, or carry this when we part. The centerpiece here is a berth in the aft row during a heavy swell. A midwife's hands press and coax. A mother murmurs a blessing in a remembered tongue. A lamp lowered through the hatch paints faces in sickly gold as the newborn comes into air. For a moment, the hold is a delivery room. Boiled linens, the sharp citrus sting of a bit of spared rum used to sterilize a blade, the newborn's first cry. Women cluster, breath held, and then released together. A small, swallowed cheer passes around the ring as a prayer is intoned and lips touch a brow. But the moment is fragile. A shout above, orders about inspection and landing, breaks the hush. A mate's boot thuds. Hands by the hatch hesitate. The midwife slips the child into a fold and whispers a name that might be a charm. The danger of separation returns like a tide. The hold is a small world of many religions, stitched together in the dark, where the deck above intones the prayers and commands of officers and crew. Below, a different liturgy works by touch, tone, and memory. Religion in the hold is not abstract doctrine, but repeated practice. Naming, singing, touching a worn cloth, murmuring an ancestor's line. Those repeated acts create a map of identity where topographic maps have been taken away. Listen, and you hear the hold's music in layers, a thin hum like a spinning thread, the percussive tap of a child's palm on rough plank, a woman's low chant that repeats the same few syllables until they become a measure of time. Without instruments, song is the body and the board. Melody is a portable ledger. Many musical features that survive into Atlantic cultures begin here in fragmentary form. Call and response scaffolds that structure recall, repeating rhythmic syllables that anchor names, and melodic contours that carry place names and kin lines across language barriers. Even a short verse can hold a list of markets or river towns, preserved in tune when paper and pen cannot travel. That sacred music sits beside coerced religion. In later decades, missionaries and zealous crews sometimes forced captives to attend prayers on deck or be catechized as a way to prepare them for sale. Those public rituals were theatrical and intended to demonstrate control. Below, responses were private and hybrid. A woman might mouth a Christian phrase while clutching a knotted charm. A hymn line might be sung with the cadence of an ancestral invocation until the two had become a single, hybrid prayer. Coercion and adaptation coexist. The same language imposed from above is repeatedly transformed into something that serves survival below. Song functions as code as well as comfort. Short refrains and call-and-response patterns can count out time, coordinate a hidden movement, or mark an agreed hour when resistance might be attempted. Where direct speech would be overheard, melody disguises intent. A verse about the sea may announce a moment, a particular rhythm can mean now. A seemingly trivial chant can be a coded countdown. Contemporary accounts of shipboard insurrections and later oral histories of plantation rebellions occasionally note songs' role in coordination, not because music is inherently conspiratorial, but because rhythm and repetition allow discrete information to pass under the crew's ear. Grief and memory braid through the same repertoire. When a person dies in the hold, the melody changes. Lullaby fragments stretch into lament. A mother's soft refrain turns into a communal mourning chant, and a recurring motif serves to name the dead aloud. These are not merely spontaneous improvisations. They are learned cultural practices that bind the living to the dead and preserve particular memories that the ledger reduces to a number. A token thrown with a body, a whispered name, a repeated verse. These small acts are purposeful acts of remembrance. Gender shapes the religious life below decks. Women often lead lullabies and private prayers. They become the custodians of mnemonic technique, teaching children verses and passing on sequences for remembering kin and place. Men's songs more often take the register of work or defiance, but boundaries blur when care or danger requires it. A woman's hush may become a chorus of warning that mobilizes a whole row. That fluidity helps knit together people from diverse linguistic backgrounds into a temporary, functioning community. Relations with crew religion are uneasy and ambivalent. Public prayers on deck can be performative, useful to captains who want to present a reformed cargo to buyers. Some crew sneer at the songs below, others listen, and, in rare moments, appropriate a phrase or two as exotic curiosity. Forced biblical recitation can be subverted. A verse intoned above may be repeated below with altered emphasis or cadence, changing its meaning from submission to a private sentence of defiance or solace for those who hear it. Material culture supports these auditory practices. Small beads, knotted cords, lengths of braided cloth, and small scraps of herb function as mnemonic anchors. A charm hidden in a hem, a knot tied to count a name, the scent of rubbed plant on a wrist. These things travel with a song and amplify its meaning. In later generations, descendants sometimes point to refrains or tokens that trace back to a crossing. Where ledgers erase, songs and amulets provide threads for reconstruction. Remembering is political as well as cultural. To sing a name below decks is to refuse a manifest. To recite an ancestor's line is to insist on personhood. Those small acts preserve memory across rupture and become the foundation for future claims of kinship, belonging, and identity in new lands. Over time, the refrains of the hold enter new musical and religious forms in the Americas. Work songs, spirituals, and creolized liturgies that scholars now trace to sequences learned by heart in the whole. Tonight, the low chorus in the hold pulls together into a single tune. A mother's hush becomes a line. Others add breath. The melody swells as names are called in sequence and a map of places folds into a song. Above, a lantern swings. A voice on the gangway pauses, listening. Then a boot stamp and a shout. Sharp, ordered, slice the air. The tune fractures and hangs in the damp dark. For a single held beat, the hold is full of breath, and everyone below knows that what comes next will decide whether memory will be silenced or made audible. Above the hold's muffled life, the captain occupies a different sensory world. Sunlight on the quarterdeck, a hand on a varnished rail, the smell of tar and iron, the crisp line of horizon where profit and peril meet. He navigates by charts and by habit, by letters from owners, and by the daily reports that arrive from below. The surgeon's entries, the bosun's log, the mate's gossip. Those reports are instruments. The captain reads them for weather, for profit, and for risk. Decision-making often looks like arithmetic. Owners instruct captains about preferred markets, acceptable mortality rates, and schedules for insurance. A ship's manifest and contracts frame the voyage before it begins. How many souls to take, which African ports to call, what American markets to reach. On deck, the captain translates those contracts into orders. He must balance the cost of extra provisions against the risk of losing marketable cargo to disease. The captain's sensory cues are militarized. He watches the color of a cough as a physician watches a patient's pallor. He notes the clustering of deaths by row and the timing of fevers like a man reading a tide. The surgeon's ledger can save or condemn him. Surgeons were often paid bonuses for lives preserved, and owners sometimes offered premiums on low mortality rates. That economic incentive shaped practice and, by extension, the captain's choices. Authority on deck is performative. The captain's voice must carry over sails. His inspections are public displays of competence. He orders the trimming of sails, the securing of stores, the stowage of fresh supplies. When disease threatens, he orders exercise and airing, and may station armed men to supervise. These measures oscillate between care and coercion. Forced airing improves circulation, but exposes captives to weather and to the gaze of the crew. Moral reasoning sits uneasily beside economic incentives. Some captains earned reputations for humane measures, taking on extra water, slowing to air the hold, or rejecting tight packing. Others prioritized profit, shortening voyages and shrinking rations. These differences were shaped by contract terms, pressure from owners, insurance calculations, and the culture of slaving networks. Courts later debated whether particular choices were criminal negligence or defensible seamanship. Across many voyages, the same choices could be read as either, depending on who held the ledger. Discipline is a captain's instrument. He signs off on floggings, confinement, and, in the most extreme cases, executions. Punishment is meant to deter insurrection and maintain order, but its severity varies. Some captains restrained their men, worried that brutality might provoke revolt. Others believed spectacle and strictness kept profit-moving machinery intact. Decisions about whom to punish and how publicly to perform it reflect judgments about deterrence, reputation, and the perceived temperament of those below decks. Navigation decisions have literal life-or-death consequences. Choosing to cut across a current, to follow a longer but calmer route, or to touch at a small island for water determines whether the ship meets bad weather or finds fresh supplies. Stopping at neutral islands or colonial ports could replenish casks and lower mortality. Pushing on to save days might save money, but cost lives. The Atlantic's geography, the lee of islands, seasonal winds, and currents entered every choice and every calculation. External pressures modulate judgments. Wars and privateering made some ports dangerous. Naval convoys and wartime premiums altered routes. Colonial officials demanded bribes or ignored slaver ships at their peril. A captain weighing a short stop might be thinking of taxes, danger of seizure, the chance to trade for provisions, or the legal hassle of an inspection that might expose the hold's condition. In many voyages, such calculations were decisive. Human unpredictability unsettles plans. Crew mutinies, storm damage, and sudden sickness force improvisation. A captain may plan to sail in one port, but faced with a snapped mast or a sudden outbreak of putrid fever, divert. Each adaptation reshapes the voyage's economics. Longer days at sea mean more rations gone and lower returns. The captain must decide whether to accept an immediate loss or gamble for the original profit target. That gamble often falls hardest on those who cannot keep accounts. Choice breeds moral ambiguity. Was refusing to call at a freshwater cove negligence or reasonable judgment when enemy sails lurked? Historians answer by cross-referencing logs, insurance claims, and testimonies. No ledger proves motive, but patterns across records reveal systemic incentives that pushed captains toward risk and tight packing. In legal inquiries, the captain's orders are scrutinized precisely because they stand between the ledger's arithmetic and human consequence. Tonight, the captain stands with a cup of tepid brandy, issuing orders clipped and precise. He has read the surgeon's notation, rising deaths aft, the spoiled cask, the tapping under the planks suggestive of coordination. The owner's letter sits in his pocket. Strict deadlines, penalties for delay. He can consult no one. The sea and the ship are his only counsel. He lifts his spyglass. On the horizon, a gray line shimmers, land or mirage. To starboard, a small sail creeps faster than it should. The mate reports it as a local trader. The charts show a lee island that promises fresh water, but also the jurisdiction of a colonial governor who taxes and inspects. The captain's choices converge. He may steer for the cove to replenish and risk ashore, or hold course and face the growing crisis below. He gives a single measured order, the syllable of command that will tilt lives towards survival or further danger. A storm arrives with no regard for ledgers. It announces itself in the long, patient language of the sea. The sky gathers weight, gulls vanish, and the horizon becomes a moving bruise. On deck, the first change is a smell, ozone, and the metallic bite of rain, and the sound of rigging beginning to sing. Men shout, canvas is reefed, blocks are manned, and the capstan labors as if the ship itself were bracing for a blow. Below decks, the storm is a feeling more than a sight. The vessel that once pitched in a steady rhythm now bucks and twists. The planks flex like lungs in fever. Water slashes seams and puddles in low corners. Latrines overflow, and the odor of rot mixes with salt. Sleep unravels. People are thrown against shackles and one another. Straw bedding slaps against walls. The noise is relentless, thunder that seems to roll from the keel up, the slap of canvas, men's curses and shouted orders. Captains face stark options. They can heave to, set opposing sails and drift at reduced speed, or run before the wind to make headway. Both choices carry cost. Heaving to risks being driven toward shoals, running risks losing masts. Either decision can lengthen a voyage, reduce rations, and increase mortality below. Owners and insurers will later pore over the logbook to judge whether seamanship or negligence decided the fate of a crossing. When the sea takes a ship apart, the practical work of survival becomes visible. Men lash hatch covers, secure barrels with wedges, and man the pumps in grim shifts as bilge water rises. The pump is a handmade engine of exertion. Men grasp a lever, haul, and empty the well into a bucket line. The bilge tastes like iron. Sailors work barefoot when necessary, hands raw with rope burn, voices hoarse from hours of shouting. If pumps cannot keep pace, the crew may be forced to cut away heavy rigging or jettison loose stores to save the hull. Jettisoning cargo has practical and legal consequences. Contemporary records show captains sometimes threw goods overboard to save their ships. The law of general average permitted shared claims on such losses. When human cargo was imperiled, the moral shock was immense, and not merely hypothetical. Some voyages became infamous when people were sacrificed under the argument of necessity. Such incidents later fed abolitionist argument and judicial scrutiny. Owners, insurers, and courts argued about what seamanship could excuse and what it could not. Below decks, a storm magnifies medical crisis. Damp holds, chafed skin from shifting chains, and sloshing water accelerate contagion. Surgeons frequently observed that storms preceded spikes in fever and dysentery. Exposure to cold, anxiety, and contaminated water invited illnesses added to their ledgers. Storms also disrupt care. Lamps snuffed by gusts, instruments sliding, poultices washed away. When a cask breaks, fresh water may briefly appear, but by the time it is handed down through hatches, it can be fouled with tar, debris, or worse. Human conduct in storms is raw and revealing. Some crewmen risk life overboard to cut away a smashed yard. Others shirk duty or drown fear in rum. Among captives, storms prompt both panic and solidarity. A mother holds her child and sings until her voice breaks. Men bracing themselves against a bulkhead form a human wedge that absorbs jolts. In that cramped violence, the social order of the hold strains and sometimes reconfigures into temporary alliances of care. Storms also create opportunities for resistance. With eyes above occupied, a coordinated act, cutting a rope, forcing a hatch, rushing a distracted watch, might become plausible. The cost is extreme. Failure during a gale invites swift, often lethal reprisals. Historical records preserve both desperate attempts and the savage deterrence that followed. The sea's fury thus amplifies moral choice and urgency in equal measure. The captain's psychology shows under pressure. He paces the quarterdeck, issuing orders through clenched teeth. His decisions, whether to cut away masts or seek shelter behind a lee island, are later judged by owners and insurers. Insurance surveys after storms probe his choices. A judicious command can save lives and cargo. A rash one can doom both. The logbook fills with terse notes. Sail damaged, pumps worked, jettison stores, crew lost. At dawn, the storm may pass, leaving new damage. A snapped mast, shredded canvas, barrels rolling, and a surface littered with plank and rope. In the hold, the aftermath smells of brine and rot. Bodies that were weak before may now be gone. The surgeon's tally climbs with the inexorable arithmetic of mortality. For survivors, water from a cracked cask tastes like salvation. A scrap of biscuit tastes like a banquet. One more consequence follows. Ports that promised relief may be politically dangerous. A lee island might mean inspection, confiscation, or arrest. The captain must weigh risk anew. Hands will be counted, ledgers will expand to include the losses. Above, the mate calls the roll. Below, names are tapped along planks in a ritual of counting and reassurance. Before full light, a cry splits the air. Overboard! A man in the sea! The shout blurs into a different alarm, one that will force choices about rescue, about who is worth risking a boat for, and about what the law and custom permit in a voyage already starved of mercy. A dark shape struggles among the whitecaps. Someone on the mizzen calls a word, name or curse, and the deck erupts into motion. Land announces itself in layers. First, a thin, green smell that is not sea but vegetation. Mangrove, wet earth, and the oily scent of decaying leaves. Then smoke, mills and distant cooking fires. The horizon that had been endless blue sharpens into a ribbon of trees, low buildings, and a whitewashed fort roofed with heat. Gulls wheel closer. A new set of sounds replaces ocean's long note. From the deck, the arrival is motion. Small boats run out, factors and pilots with ledger books. Voices carry across the water, shouts about pilotage fees, who will attend the market. On the gangway, the mate hollers. Crew hand down fresh water, sacks, and strips of cloth. For those below, these sounds are a new grammar. Each shout promises a change in the map of survival. The surgeon performs final checks. His ledger must certify the number living and dead. Port officials may demand a health letter. His entries travel beyond the voyage into courts and pamphlets. But in this moment, his pen notes only immediate facts. How many could be moved? How many required care? Who might be deemed unfit? Before hatches open, a ritual begins. Captives are washed on deck when weather and crew allow. Recorded practice in many accounts. The washing is practical and public. Brooms, brine, and fresh water are used to show muscle and hide the grime of the hold. Hair is roughly combed. Open sores are bound or hidden. Children receive the last sweet gruel. The aim is to make bodies legible for shore eyes. Inspection is theatrical. Buyers and factors circle, testing with fingers. A tug at an arm, a check of teeth, a probe of a joint. Temper is asked about, an ambiguous term folding together labor capacity and obedience. Merchants prod scars, test mobility, and talk bluntly of age and strength. Those below are shown in sunlight, their bodies examined as goods under a taxonomist's gaze. Contemporary advertisements and sale notices later make this practice plain in cold prose. On the quay, the market forms like a living tide. Buyers step forward in coats stiff with salt and dust. Planters in heavy boots with the look of landowners who have never known the ocean's mercy. Agents, called factors, carry ledgers and a small brass rod used to tap a chest or test muscle. Children of planters, curious and cruel, press forward to stare. Dogs weave through ankles. A smell of cheap rum and tobacco hangs near one cluster of men. The quay is a chorus of coin clinks, collars creaking, and shouted price. For those being sold, the world narrows to close details. The hot press of sun on skin just washed. The sting of tar where a plank had rubbed. The taste of the last biscuit. Names that people had held to quiet themselves on the voyage now risk being traded away. Families, when not already separated, are read aloud as lots. A mother may find herself parted from children to satisfy a buyer's specification. The human calculus of the market is surgical. Age, apparent strength, and scars determine who is led to which field or house. The period immediately after landing, historically called seasoning, is a grim induction. New arrivals were sometimes taken to compounds where they were fed, taught new words, and driven into labor to break resistance and adapt them to local conditions. This process could be long and brutal. Plantation records and narratives show that survival of this period often determined an enslaved person's life chances. The shore's hospitality, in other words, could be a savage form of schooling. The smell near the quay is contradictory. Brine, horse dung, tar, and the bright sting of lime used to whiten walls. Inland, the air thickens with sweetness, cane vats steaming, molasses, and the warm rot of sugar processing. For people who only knew the sea, these scents are bewildering, promise and threat braided together. Disembarkation is choreography and force. Ropes and gangways narrow into veins through which people are moved. Each person is led up, often bound until the last moment, and handed into small boats rowed by buyers or local boatmen. Eyes blink in sunlight and confusion. Hands that once searched seams seek railings and find only ropes and strangers. A child clutches a charm. A mother rocks a baby and steadies herself on a thwart. The small, private economies that kept life possible on the voyage, hidden crumbs, shared cloth, are now exposed to port eyes and new rules. Translators and intermediaries move among the crowd, calling out in pidgin or in known African tongues the lots, the prices, and the buyer's preferences. These men shape markets. They judge physical fitness, whisper recommendations, and translate what buyers cannot see. Historians note how coastal origin and perceived temper influenced where people were sold and into what work they were placed. Legal formalities follow. Customs officers, quay masters, and local physicians may board to attest to cargo and duty. Where colonial officials attend, ships face more scrutiny. Certificates are checked, duties calculated, and the ship's papers inspected for legality. For captives, this is a second corridor of power beyond iron and planks. At the quay, a factor points to a distant plantation house tucked among cane rows. A skiff is prepared. A woman who has borne the voyage's strain is helped into the boat. The sun catches a sewn charm at her throat, and for a breath the child in her arms thinks warmth might be home. A trumpet sounds from the levee, businesslike, ceremonial. Men compare papers and signatures. The captain steps forward to parley. At that instant, a shout from the fort slices through the air. An order that the cargo be held for inspection. Heads turn toward the ramparts. A flag dips. The landing, it seems, will not be routine. The market is a theater of exchange choreographed in ledger ink and loud voices. It is where the ship's arithmetic becomes coin and certificate, where lives counted in the surgeon's book and packed in the hold are converted into documents. Bills of sale, certificates of health, and receipts, and then dispersed across plantations. The quay's dust becomes a stage for negotiation. Cloth stalls, makeshift scales, the metallic clink of cash, and men in coats who move as if nothing in the world could surprise them. Around them, people who have crossed an ocean stand in the bright heat and wait. Buyers arrive in different kinds. Some are planters come with a list. Need field hands, one woman good with young children, 2 sturdy men for cane cutting, practical and brisk. Others are agents or factors who buy for absentee owners, weighing price against transport and the costs of seasoning. Still others are speculators who think in terms of resale, to a household, to an artisan, to another plantation. Each has a ledger of their own, a preferred age bracket, and a mental conversion factor. What a 20-year-old male, sound in limb, will earn in a decade of labor. Inspection is a ritual of touch and appraisal. Fingers probe muscle and joint, tap chests and forearms, and ask buyers to perform simple motions. Bend, lift, carry a sack. A common practice is the tap test, where a brass rod or a cane is used to wrap a chest or leg. The reverberation, to these men, supposedly indicates health. Teeth are checked, wounds and scars cataloged. Sellers sometimes try to hide defects. Extra combing and sunning remove enough grime to improve appearance. A hidden poultice or a bandage reed might cover a wound. The public washing on deck creates a brief theater of cleaning and display, designed to present bodies as fit and marketable. The language of sale is blunt and transactional. Temper becomes a catchword, an imprecise term folding endurance, docility, and labor capacity into one. Buyers ask about origin, where on the coast a person was taken, because certain origins fetch higher prices for perceived attributes, or because buyers believe certain groups adapt better to particular climates or tasks. Sellers answer in half-truths, or with the help of coastal intermediaries who translate and spin origins to advantage. Negotiation is noisy and shrewd. Prices are proposed, countered, and pulled into shape by the market's overall mood. Crop's current price, recent labor shortages, even rumor of bad weather that might delay ships. Auctions can be public and fast. An auctioneer's call rises, buyers shout numbers, hands raise, and a hammer or a signed paper concludes the sale. Other transactions are private, negotiated over a table, while portside clerks draft the bill and scratch signatures. A bill of sale, once signed, moves authority and liability. It becomes a legal document that transforms person into property in the eyes of colonial courts. Paperwork grows like a net around the transaction. Certificates of health, signed, sometimes perfunctory, attest to the surgeon's assessment. Customs papers list duties. Bills of lading and purchase receipts are stored in the factor's chest. Insurance claims are filed for losses or jettisoned property. When disputes arise, these papers are reopened as evidence. Owners and captains who hope to avoid prosecution tend to keep neat, defensible records, signatures, dated entries, and explicit clauses about unforeseen loss. The ledger is both instrument and shield. The small human economies continue within view of the market. Intermediaries, translators, interpreters, and a few familiar faces from other ports move among buyers and sellers, suggesting matches, calming disputes, and sometimes arranging clandestine deals. A sailor with a soft conscience may have smuggled a parcel of biscuit for a particular mother. A careful buyer might offer wages to an interpreter to discover whether a child is likely to be ill. These micro-contracts, hidden payments, promises to a tamped-down seller, an additional piece of cloth, shape outcomes in ways that the main ledger never registers. Separation is the transaction's most brutal rhythm. Families are appraised in lots. Sometimes factors deliberately separate mothers from sons to fetch higher total sums. A mother called forward to be sold for a plantation household may be forced to hand a child to another buyer or to a clerk who shoves the child into another line. There are gestures of last intimacy in the ramp of the key, hands pressed into hair, charms hidden inside collars, a whispered name passed into a child's ear as a secret guard against stranger eyes. Buyers occasionally note these gestures in passing with a cold efficiency. Sold with infant. Lot includes child. But the ledger cannot capture the humiliation, the bargaining, or the tearful bargaining for a small scrap of what once was family. Resistance and cunning appear even in the market. People sometimes refuse to be sold to known cruel masters, screaming names or collapsing theatrically to deter a buyer. On other occasions, a buyer's interest is stoked by a rumor that someone carries skill, weaving, cooking, midwifery, and private sales are arranged with a favor that will later be repaid. Escape attempts at the quay occur too, sudden dashes toward a crowd, a leap into a boat's shadow, or the swift snatching of a child. Each attempt risks bullets, dogs, and the law. Sometimes, in the crush, a cry from the crowd will reveal a surprising identity, someone recognized by a person on the quay as kin, or as a local, which can halt or complicate a sale. As auctions end, papers are prepared and hands are exchanged. A signature, a sealed stamp, coins slid into a pocket, and the market disperses like wind. Buyers lead their purchases away in small files. Factors record each lot. Port clerks stamp the final receipts. The captain watches the dispersal with an accountant's satisfaction. The mate counts ship's stores and prepares for the return voyage. But the ledger sometimes betrays a problem. A factor's pen hesitates over one line. He mutters a word, detained, and stamps a note on a paper. A uniformed official approaches, holding a second parchment. Someone in the crowd, an interpreter who rarely stays long at a quay, shouts out a name that seems to match a whispered token at a woman's throat. The shout is thin but sharp. It ripples across the dock and stops a buyer mid-step. In that sudden pause, the air tightens. A paper on a desk, a shouted name, and the possibility of a claim, legal, personal, or both, hang between seller and buyer. For a fragment of a breath, everything written in ink is at risk of unraveling. Law sits on the quay like a heavy bench, polished wood, iron hinges, and a small brass plate that tells merchants where to sign. But law is porous. It is written in different hands and read in different tongues. For people who crossed the Middle Passage, the legal world was both a barrier and, occasionally, a thin, dangerous doorway. Documents, manifests, surgeons' entries, bills of sale, and customs papers could mean sale, seizure, or, in rare instances, the possibility of freedom. Courtrooms smell of ink, oil, and stout wood polish. Lawyers in wigs move with a practiced cadence, their voices measured against the judge's bench. Into that room come paper proofs, a surgeon's ledger with deaths ticked off in a tidy column, the captain's log with notations about stops and storms, receipts for insurance or brine-damaged stores. Owners use such records as shields, proof that loss was due to weather, not neglect. Abolitionists turn the same papers into evidence of systemic cruelty, placing diagrams like the Brookes illustration beside surgeons' notes to make a moral case that could be read by juries and readers. Some legal moments became famous because they exposed that tension between law and human life. Somerset versus Stuart in 1772, litigated in English courts, pressed questions about slavery's reach on British soil. The case's reverberations reached ports and hearts on both sides of the Atlantic. Other incidents, most notoriously the Zong case of 1781, where over 100 enslaved people were thrown overboard and the owners sought insurance, forced public and legal scrutiny into the arithmetic of human sacrifice. Those court papers entered public discussion. Depositions, insurance claims, and the bitter columns of pamphlets and newspapers. They showed how the language of loss and the language of life could be twisted into opposite ends. Within the local legal frame, the law looked less like philosophy and more like daily practice. Colonial slave codes, municipal bylaws, and quarantine statutes all shaped what could happen at a key. Officials enforced port duties and health certificates. Magistrates signed detentions. Customs houses assessed cargo for taxes. These bureaucratic acts determined whether a ship's human cargo would remain on the dock a day longer or be dispersed in haste. For captives, each parchment, each stamp had direct consequence. Yet law sometimes offered faint slivers of recourse. Freedom suits, legal petitions filed by enslaved people or by others on their behalf, emerged in multiple colonies and later in American courts. They were difficult, costly, and perilous, but they worked within the legal logic of empire to challenge it. Some suits appealed to technicalities, improper paperwork, jurisdictional oddities, or a promise of manumission written in an owner's hand. Others invoked broader principles, the perilous logic that if a master carried a person into a jurisdiction where slavery was disallowed, the law might recognize a different status. These cases were never a safe path for most, but the fact they existed shows how legal instruments could sometimes be wielded against a system that relied on ink to make bodies property. Outside the courthouse, law and custom produced subtler shadows. Local agents, the factors, customs clerks, and intermediaries often bent formalities to suit commerce. A stamped document could be delayed, a surgeon's note fudged, or an interpreter's claim of origin adjusted to make a sale easier. These small corruptions were part of the market's grease. They also created openings for cunning resistance. A forged travel document, a misattributed rubric, or a sympathetic clerk's quiet note could delay sale long enough for a rescue or a claim to be made. Maroon communities formed another kind of legal shadow, places beyond the reach of colonial law where runaways could seek refuge and from which coordinated resistance sometimes sprang. In the Americas, Maroon settlements from Brazil to Jamaica organized alternative polities, negotiated treaties, or staged raids on plantations. Their existence complicated the legal calculus of slaveholding societies. Fear of flight and of organized resistance pushed some planters to prefer quick sales, others to harden discipline, and colonial officials to tighten patrols and laws. The presence of Maroons made quayside decisions more urgent. A hurried sale might prevent a reunion across a wooded ridge, or it might feed an economy of clandestine flight. Not all resistance engaged formal law. Petitioning masters, bargaining through intermediaries, or claiming kinship to free persons were tactics that used the language of property to argue for different outcomes. Shipboard charms and tokens, small cloths, names sewn into hems, occasionally resurfaced as documentary evidence in court when a person tried to assert family ties or prior status. These fragile private artifacts could become legal anchors, a signed note of manumission hidden in a trunk, a baptismal certificate kept by a sympathetic crew member, or the testimony of a sailor who remembered a name. Courts sometimes heard such fragments, and they sometimes decided cases on the margin of that evidence. A different legal battleground was insurance and maritime law. Insurers and owners argued over what losses were extraordinary and insurable. The Zong decision and its aftermath highlighted how maritime law could be repurposed to rationalize human sacrifice. Public outrage spurred abolitionists to use legal culture to their advantage. They published depositions, dramatized cases in pamphlets, and brought moral pressure to bear on juries and parliaments. The contest was not only about precedent, but about public conscience and the shaping of legal imagination. Investigations and inquiries after controversial voyages pulled into public view the hold's private world. Parliamentary committees, colonial inquiries, and magistrates' courts subpoenaed surgeon logs, called crew to testify, and asked captains to account for their choices. These proceedings reproduce the ship's life in a public theater, an attempt to make the hidden visible. For survivors who were fortunate or resourceful, testimony before a magistrate or a sympathetic lawyer could produce a rare advantage: delay, detention of cargo, or a negotiated release. For most, however, the legal system closed the same way it opened, into papers, signatures, and the hard fact of ownership. On the quay, a clerk now stamps a paper with a heavy hand and passes it to a uniformed official. The crowd leans forward. A woman whose voyage still scars her face steps toward the clerk, wordlessly pressing a small strip of cloth into his palm, the charm she has hidden for months. The clerk eyes it, then the paper. He looks up, and for one held beat, the legal machinery seems to hesitate. Night hides plans. On La Amistad, the plan begins in the half-light of memory, not on a ledger. Men from the Mende-speaking region, newly packed below decks in Havana, taught each other names and songs and, most crucially, shared a single resolve: to be free. The revolt on the Amistad in July 1839 is one of the clearest, best documented examples of what people trapped in the Middle Passage could do when opportunity and leadership met courage. The violence of the moment is immediate and raw. In the hours after landing at one port and being moved to a small schooner, a group led by Sengbe Pie, later known to American audiences as Joseph Sankei, seized knives and machetes, rushed the few crew who remained aboard, and killed the captain and a cook. Contemporary accounts describe surprise, rapid action, blood on planks, and the quick seizure of control. They spared some crew members and compelled a navigator to attempt to return them toward Africa, but the course and geography soon confused the voyage and led them into American waters instead. What makes the Amistad extraordinary is not merely the revolt itself, but the way law and public opinion turned toward it. The captives were at once accused mutineers and petitioners for liberty. Spanish owners asserted property claims. The United States found itself embroiled in an international dispute that touched on maritime law, property law, and the rising abolitionist movement. Abolitionist groups seized the case as vivid proof of illegal trafficking and as a moral test for a nation that still allowed slavery in many places. The courtroom imagined the ship the way the hold had been, a close space where memory and fact collided. Ship logs, manifests, and surviving crew statements were pressed against the captives' testimony, translated through interpreters, and against the testimony of abolitionist witnesses. The men insisted they had been kidnapped in West Africa and sold illegally in Cuba. They argued that resisting unlawful captivity was an act of self-preservation rather than a criminal mutiny. That claim forced judges and lawyers to confront the messy overlap of private property law and human rights. The public theater surrounding the trial was vivid. John Quincy Adams, a former president-turned-abolitionist advocate, appeared before the U.S. Supreme Court to argue for the captives' freedom, drawing on precedent and moral argument. Newspapers printed diagrams of the ship, reports of testimony, and editorials that divided communities. Public meetings and sermons used the case to rally opinion. For abolitionists, the Amistad represented a potent narrative, a group of men who had seized their fate and then stood in public to demand justice. Sensory detail in those moments matters. The courtroom smelled of ink and wax. The accused men sat with the salt of long sea journeys in their hair and voices rough from shouting and strain. Interpreters rendered Mende names and songs into English, and those songs became part of the evidentiary record, anchoring the men to a homeland and contradicting claims that they were merely cargo. In the galleries, the public whispered. Some listeners were moved to pity, others hardened to legal technicalities. Yet the legal process could not erase trauma. Men who had been villagers and fishermen now endured cross-examination, hostile witnesses, and the slow churn of appeals. Language barriers created misunderstandings. Cultural practices were flattened into categories the court could digest. Still, the case produced rare openings. Abolitionist societies raised funds for defense and sustenance. Lawyers offered pro bono representation. Sympathetic officials provided shelter. In a paradox, the courtroom became another contested hold, a place where legal argument and moral persuasion could sometimes be redirected toward justice. In 1841, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in favor of the captives, concluding that they had been illegally enslaved and that they retained the right to resist. The decision secured their legal freedom and allowed supporters to organize funds for their return to Africa. The ruling was a legal and symbolic victory, that abolitionists used to argue against the broader institution of slavery, even as the institutional structures that continued to oppress millions remained in place. The Amistad's publicity also exposed limits. The revolt succeeded partly because a particular sequence of events produced a public case. Illegal trade routes, the peculiar geography of a small schooner, a nearby U.S. port, and an organized network of activists ready to mobilize. Many other uprisings were crushed without witnesses. Many survivors never found lawyers or allies. The Amistad teaches that law can sometimes be a tool for liberation, but only when circumstances, advocacy, and political will align. For those listening in cramped holds elsewhere, the Amistad story likely traveled as rumor, an ember of possibility, rather than a straightforward manual for revolt. For historians and descendants, it remains a powerful example of agency and legal contestation, a case where deliberate courage, allied support, and the slow machinery of courts together produced a rare outcome. Tonight, in a hold where men tap rhythms to count time, the name Sengbe Pie may be uttered like a spell. The memory of the Amistad hangs like a lantern between rows, proof that chains can be overthrown and that courage, when it meets law and sympathy, can change a fate. Yet the next stage of that story is not the ship alone. It is the slow, public grind of hearings, depositions, and appeals that will decide whether a verdict means return or continued bondage. Land makes new rhythms, but it does not make whole what the sea has taken. Arrival begins a second crossing, not across water, but across social worlds. Some who survived the hold found themselves hard at work, in cane fields or tobacco rows within days. Others were apprenticed to house tasks or trained as artisans. The work reorganized bodies and time. Dawn collapsed into onerous routine, the sun carved the hours into labor, and the night became a thin, reprieve-stitched interlude. Through all this, the old networks, kin, village roles, ritual knowledge, were shredded and reshaped. Separation was immediate and ordinary. Buyers split families for price and purpose, strong men to the field, women to the house, children to gardeners or domestic service, the elderly to menial tasks. Those transactional divisions hardened into life patterns. Plantation regimes enforced new naming practices, European naming customs, and legal identities that replaced native ones. Baptismal records and plantation ledgers recorded Christian names, ages approximated, and labor categories assigned. The documents that made a person property began also to be the clues later used by descendants and historians, trying to follow lives erased from maps. Seasoning camps and compound life inflicted another transformation. Newly arrived people were worked hard to break resistance, to teach plantation drudgery, accustom bodies to local crops and diseases, and to remake social habits that might interfere with profitable labor. The seasoning period killed many and hardened others into habits of endurance. But it also produced living strategies, shared cooking schedules designed to stretch rations, clandestine seed gardens behind cookhouses, and the quiet teaching of home songs and prayers to children who would otherwise forget the rhythm of a distant shore. Cultural survival took many forms. Language shifted. Full fluency in West African tongues often broke within a generation, but words, refrains, and names endured in household speech, in foodways, and in musical patterns. Work songs and spirituals, call and response forms born in the ship and adapted on field and quay, became the backbone of communal memory. Food traditions also carried across. Particular stews, methods of cassava or rice preparation, spice blends, and modes of preservation traveled through the bodies of cooks who kept ancestral techniques alive under different skies. Religion syncretized. Catholic devotions met ancestral rites and produced hybrid practices that anchored identity in small, repeated gestures. Families invented new solidarities. Extended kinship sometimes reformed along plantation lines. People who had known each other from the same coast clustered where possible. Others adopted fictive kin systems, aunties and uncles, who were not blood-related but who held responsibility for children and for prayer. These bonds mattered in legal and practical terms. A network could pool small goods to buy a child's exemption from sale, pay for a brief trip to a nearby town, or raise funds for a petition to free an individual. Collective action was not always visible in archives, but it repeatedly surfaces in narratives and depositions. Manumission and free communities complicate the picture. Some enslaved people secured freedom through purchase, manumission granted by owners, militia service, or court decisions. The free black communities that grew in port towns and certain colonies demonstrate alternative trajectories: skilled laborers, skiers, small property holders, and active political agents. Yet freedom in many colonies was precarious. Laws curtailed movement, economic opportunities, and family formation. Even so, free people of color sometimes used legal and commercial savvy to locate kin, buy relatives' freedom, or sponsor missions to repatriate people to Africa. Repatriation projects, state-sponsored or private, offer one strand of afterlife. Sierra Leone and Liberia are the most famous examples. Colonies and settlements formed in part from people freed in the Americas or in Britain who then sought return to African soil. Those movements altered identities again. Some returnees found their languages and lands changed. Some integrated into coastal polities, and some became leaders in new settlements. Repatriation was not a universal fix. For many, it meant negotiating new social hierarchies and sometimes encountering suspicion from people long settled in West Africa. Escape and maroonage also rewrote lives. Maroon communities, Quilombos in Brazil, Palenques in Spanish America, and remote settlements across the Caribbean offered refuge and political alternatives. They transmitted memory and military resistance. Maroon polities staged raids, negotiated treaties, and sometimes pressed colonial authorities for recognition. Such communities reshaped demographics and pushed planters toward harsher discipline or toward different market strategies. The archive of afterlives is partial and usually mediated. Slave narratives, baptismal records, plantation ledgers, and court papers form the backbone of what historians can read. Oral histories and cultural practices supply the texture that documents often bluntly miss. Stories collected decades or generations later reveal how names, songs, and small objects, an amulet, a shawl stitched with a place name, a burial rite, carried memory forward. Genealogists now piece together fragmented paper trails that cross continents. Letters, probate inventories, and wills that list names. Port manifests and brig logs that offer moments of visibility in otherwise opaque lives. Grief remains a long echo. When children are sold away, by force, or because a buyer offered coin that could feed an elder sibling, those separations create multi-generational voids. Sometimes a returned letter or a rumor of kin in a neighboring plantation sustains hope. Sometimes memory degenerates into rumor. The legal machinery and the market's appetite create absences carved into family trees, leaving descendants with questions only partially answerable in the ledger's scratched ink. Yet memory resists annihilation. Names survive in secret whispers, in songs, in the choice of a particular day of fasting, in the plant a family cultivates at the edge of a field. Sometimes a single curious notation in a remaindered ledger, an unusual name, a baptismal date, a mention of mother attached to a child, becomes a thread that descendants follow 2 centuries later. These small traces are both promise and cruelty, proof that a life existed and an outline of how systemic violence remade it. Tonight, in a house under a sugar press's shadow, an elder hums a faint melody that the child at her knee has never heard before. The tune carries words that are not entirely English. They hold town names and a small blessing. Outside, a ledger in the planter's cabin sits open on a table. An entry dated the year of the arrival shows a name that matches the elder's whispered phrase. A thin line of ink connects a word spoken at night to a formal entry on paper, the kind of connection that makes search, testimony, and memory suddenly possible. Paper has a smell. Old ink like iron and lemon, the faint musk of parchment, the stiff whisper of folded sheets. Histories of the Middle Passage live in those smells and sounds. Ledgers, manifests, surgeons' journals, bills of sale, customs rolls, petitions, and court dockets, each one a brittle square of human consequence. To trace a crossing is to move between archives, to follow threads of ink across oceans and centuries, and to understand how documents both reveal and conceal the lives they record. Ships' logs record motion and weather. They mark latitudes, courses, and the quotidian decisions a captain makes about stopovers and routes. Surgeons' journals register fevers, purges, and the basic remedies administered below decks. Manifests list numbers in columns. Bills of sale transform persons into itemized lots. Plantation ledgers enter births, deaths, labor output, and punishments. Baptismal registers quietly preserve given names and dates that sometimes become the only legal trace of a life. Insurance papers catalog risk, claim jettisoned goods, and sometimes recast human loss as maritime necessity. Each document is written by a particular hand with a particular purpose. Together they form a contested archive. Witness testimony complicates the paper trail. Crew depositions often serve particular interests. A mate's recollection can exculpate a captain. A factor's note can smooth over abuse. Buyers and owners write with profitability in mind. Surgeons, trained in observation but paid by masters, can be candid or circumspect. The rare voices of survivors, narratives, depositions, and interviews cut through ledger abstraction with sensory detail, naming homes, kin, and routes. Those first-person accounts are invaluable precisely because they translate measured columns into lived experience. The smell of soaked biscuit, the rhythm of a lullaby, the feel of an iron cuff. Translation is a persistent filter. Names and place names uttered in Mende, Yoruba, Akan, or Fon were transcribed by clerks unfamiliar with those languages. Spellings warped into European conventions and meanings shifted in the process. Interpreters mediated markets and courts. Some relayed testimony faithfully, others used translation as leverage. A misrendered name might shift a sale. A mistranslated petition could become legally worthless. In courtroom settings, the chain of transmission, African language to coastal pidgin to legal English, introduced layers where nuanced distance thinned and meaning could be lost or weaponized. Material evidence supplements text. Archaeologists recover iron rings, ship fittings, ceramics, and food remains that show diet and stowage. Wrecks and port deposits yield tactile proof. A rusted shackle as in a soil layer, a broken strap, a mass of charred planks. Such objects confront the sterile authority of paper with the stubborn fact of bodily presence. Forensic analyses, contextualizing artifacts with stratigraphy, residue studies, and isotopic data, can suggest origins, diet, and movement in ways documents alone cannot. Physical things anchor the abstractions on paper to real, lived bodies. Oral memory travels where paper often fails. Songs, naming practices, culinary traditions, and family tales can preserve a geography of origin and a map of relation. An old melody hummed in a coastal village, a cooking method passed down by grandmother, or a secret charm tucked into a hem may point to a specific region of the African coast. Anthropologists and genealogists cross-reference these living clues with shipping lists and parish registers to rebuild fragmented genealogies. Oral archives are not merely sentimental. They are forms of evidence encoded in bodies and repeated practice. The archive is political. Documents are produced by actors with agendas: owners, insurers, surgeons, magistrates, abolitionists, and those agendas shape what is written and how it is read. Abolitionists harnessed surgeon journals, diagrams, and depositions to mobilize public opinion. Owners used the same material to defend their practice as commerce within maritime law. Courts often read paper as proof, and sometimes transformed private cruelty into legal questions. Parliamentary inquiries, colonial commissions, and local magistrates added further layers of record, each refracting the past differently. Forensic reading reveals erasure and artifice. Marginal corrections, scraped lines, and missing pages can indicate deliberate manipulation. Palimpsests and recycled paper show how economized reuse sometimes obliterated testimony. The absence of a manifest, the deliberate omission of crew names, or a surgeon's blank entry become evidence in themselves. Historians learn to read silences, what is not written, who is unnamed, and to triangulate across sources to assemble a fuller, though still provisional picture. Sometimes the archive yields startling corroborations. A small scrap of cloth sewn into a ledger, a bead pressed between pages, or an entry in a baptismal register with an unusual name can link a refrain hummed in a cabin to a line on a page. Such discoveries are charged moments, a name recovered, a connection remade across oceans and generations. They provide descendants with a thread to follow and give historians a concrete anchor for narrative reconstruction. Yet the archive rarely grants tidy closure. Records fragment, witnesses die, paper decays. Evidence is provisional and contested. The historian's task is detective and storyteller both, to stitch surgeons' notes, manifests, archaeological finds, oral testimony, and legal depositions into a plausible narrative while being candid about gaps and uncertainty. Each recovered name is a small victory and also a reminder of the countless silences that remain. Back at the port clerk's stall, the hesitant stamp is lifted. The clerk opens a ledger and, folded between two pages, finds a small slip of paper, brittle, stained with salt, that bears a single name, a coastal place, and a date. The mark is faint, but for an ear attuned to fragments, it sings. A bridge between a cramped hold and a house 2 continents away. The clerk's hand pauses. He thinks of signatures, stamps, and the power of a single line of ink to change a life's trace. He looks up toward the quay, where a uniformed official advances with a sealed packet in his hand. The last thing you learn about the hold is how loud its silences can be. Those absences, blank columns, erased names, trunks of unrecorded songs, have a weight that presses forward into the present. The story of the Middle Passage does not stop when a ship slips its anchor or when an auctioneer's hammer falls. It unfolds in the long after, in the ways communities remember, in the archives that relent, in the art that conjures absent voices, and in the decisions public institutions now make about what to preserve, display, and repair. Memory arrives in many tongues. For descendants, it comes as a melody hummed on a grandmother's porch, a clasp charm passed beneath a pillow, a recipe that no book taught them, but that their hands know how to make. For scholars, memory is a method, patient tracing across surgeons' journals, parish registers, court papers, and ship manifests to reconnect the scattered pieces. For communities, memory is practice. Annual commemorations, reclaimed burial grounds, songs taught to children, and oral histories collected with care and respect. These acts are both remedy and evidence. They insist that what was treated as commodity is also a source of relation and meaning. Museums and memorials hold a difficult place in this work. A shackle behind glass can educate millions, but it can also obscure by removing context, treating an object as isolated proof rather than the residue of relational violence. Responsive curation has emerged, exhibitions co-curated with descendant communities, panels that name places and people, audio tracks that return the voices of descendants to the galleries. Memorial design now tries to avoid the cold logic of the ledger by foregrounding lived experience. Grooved benches inscribed with names, sound installations that replay songs with the cadence of the hold, and interactive archives that allow visitors to follow a cargo manifest into a living family tree. Museums are changing, but not uniformly. The work of reckoning with the past remains unfinished. Legal and political legacies continue to be argued in courtrooms and parliaments. Debates about reparations, about the return of artifacts, about formal apologies and institutional accountability are modern echoes of the ledger's old arithmetic. Who owes what, to whom, and on what terms? Reparative frameworks ask for more than money. They demand truth-telling, memorial education, and structural change in public institutions. Where reparations have moved forward, they often combine material redress with investments in cultural memory, funding for archives, support for descendant-led research projects, and resources for community centers that teach ancestral crafts and languages. Art takes the memory into other forms. Poets translate the creak of a ship's timbers into metaphor. Sculptors cast voids where names were lost. Musicians stitch old refrains into new symphonies. These works do an important thing. They let feeling migrate from the archive's dryness into imaginative life. A song that names a coastal river, or a potter's rhythm that traces an island path, can perform a kind of reattachment. Stories, whether in film, theater, visual art, or oral recounting, build bridges between the technicalities of ledgers and the human scale of names, faces, gestures. Scholarship continues to refine the record. Interdisciplinary teams use isotopic analysis to suggest childhood lands from bone chemistry. Genetics sometimes links diasporic families back to particular coastal regions. Maritime archaeology maps wrecks and stowage patterns. These scientific methods do not replace narratives. They deepen them, offering tangible measures that can corroborate oral histories and archival traces. New discoveries, cracked shackle finds, a forgotten parish register, a surgeon's marginalia discovered in a private chest, open spaces to re-ask long-settled assumptions. The archive is not closed, it yields, sometimes slowly, sometimes in startling ways. One of the most human outcomes is the recovery of names. A single signature in a probate document, a baptism entry, or a surviving scrap. An embroidered cloth, a prayer tucked in a pocket, can re-anchor a line of descent. Genealogists and community historians work like cartographers of loss, connecting scraps across decades until a thin map emerges, a family reassembled, a story reclaimed. Each recovered name is a small reparation, a way to honor continuity that the market and the law had tried to erase. Education is where future reckonings are decided. Curricula that teach the Middle Passage as history rather than as a sidebar, lessons that include primary documents, survivor narratives, and local memorials, change public awareness. When children encounter the surgeon's ledger alongside the song that a grandmother hums, they learn complexity, that systems caused suffering, and that communities preserve dignity. Memory work in schools and public institutions builds a civic muscle that can fuel legal and political action. There is also quiet, daily work that matters. Descendant communities preserving family songs, volunteers uncovering forgotten grave markers, librarians digitizing fragile ship manifests. These acts accumulate. They are small and often invisible, but they change the conditions of possibility. When a newly digitized manifest is posted online, a descendant on the other side of an ocean finds a line that matches a family tale. When a small museum reinstates an oral history into its display, visitors who had never heard those voices before sit in a new and necessary discomfort. Finally, the legacy insists on moral attention. The story of the Middle Passage asks us to see modern institutions, markets, legal codes, shipping practices, not as neutral technologies, but as human arrangements that can be rethought. It compels a reimagining of public memory that centers dignity, acknowledges complicity, and supports practical measures to repair wrongs. It asks descendants, scholars, institutions, and citizens to collaborate, to listen, to fund, to archive, to teach. Tonight, in a small coastal room where light falls on a faded ledger, a descendant reads aloud the single name found between the pages, the name that has traveled in song and now finds ink to match it. Outside, the sea rises, familiar and indifferent. Inside, a voice repeats the name until it echoes like a bell. The sound fills the room and stretches toward a future in which memory insists on being more than absence.